Thanksgiving edition of This Week in Pro Football. I'm always honored to be joined by Mike Lombardi, longtime NFL executive with San Francisco, New England, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and a few other teams. A host of the GM Shuffle podcast, and he's got a book. Michael's got the author of Football Done Right, setting the record straight on the coaches, players, and history of the NFL. Michael, how are you? We're not hearing you, Mike. Can we get Michael unmuted?
Go.
There you go. I got you, Michael. How are you?
I'm great. Happy Thanksgiving. I apologize. Hope all is well with you.
Everything is fine. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to join me on this night before Thanksgiving. Michael, let me ask you to look back just a couple of days to a game, by the way, that had the highest ratings of a Monday night game in 25 years, that being the Eagles win over Kansas City. 28 million people watched some parts of that game. Michael, first, just a synopsis of the game and how Philadelphia won it. I was opining in the open that it's a sign of a great team that you win games when you're not always playing your best. I'd like to get your take on that first off.
Well, I mean, look, every game, the people think it's easy to win games in the NFL. Marty Schottenheimer's won 200 games in the regular season, and he can't get into the Hall of Fame. He's one of 8 coaches. People take for granted that those games are easy to win. And the Chiefs are a really good team, and the Chiefs are not the same team offensively that they've been in the past. And, the Eagles were able to win the red zone. They created 2 turnovers in the red zone, Kelsey's fumble and Mahomes' interception. So there's 2 scores, and they were able to put enough pressure on them where Mahomes had to throw it over 40 times for 177 yards, which isn't very good. So it was a well-earned defensive victory for them, and it's hard to move the football on the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City didn't score in the second half. This is the 3rd straight game Kansas City hasn't scored in the second half. Not a field goal, not a touchdown. They've been 0-0 in the second half. They've only scored 19 points in the fourth quarter. So I think it was a really good victory. To win in Kansas City is difficult, and they come away with it, and it was important. Look, you're never going to have everybody wants to grade football games like we're in the Olympics.
Right.
That's not how you do it. You win, you go on to the next game.
Correct. All right. So let me just segue for just a second, because I want to get back to the point you just made about how you win, you go on. But just a word, Mike, because you've been in so many front offices and you've been in that GM chair. How did the Chiefs fail to invest at all in wide receivers? You mentioned how he had to throw the ball so often. The number of drops in that game.
Well, they lead the league in drops. That just wasn't that game. They lead the league in drops. They had 26 going into the game. Mahomes only had 33 all of last year. And so what happened to them is Andy decided to do what typically he did in Philadelphia. Right. He invested in his offensive line. He signed Taylor. He signed Smith. He paid Tooney a lot of money. And so he had a really good – now, I'm not sure the line's as good as he invested in it. And then he was developing some of these young receivers. I think they really believed Tony was going to come along and take that giant step forward. And that hasn't happened. They've got Rice. I mean, their second best receiver is Watson. Yeah. And I don't think they predicted that they were going to drop as many passes. And so, look, I think Andy's modified the team now. Parcells used to say this all the time. Once you get to Thanksgiving, you got to figure out who your team is. Right. Let's be clear. The Eagles are a team that they hadn't run the ball, and yet they were able to win the game. They made more plays, and their defensive front was able to hang in there and really put pressure on Mahomes and force him to move around. So I think the Eagles know who they are, and I think the Chiefs know who they are. But the Chiefs' margin for victory, Pat, is reduced. We're not used to seeing that, right? Mahomes could overcome everything.
Yep.
But he can't any longer. So when you turn it over twice in the red area, you drop a touchdown pass, those are points that you give away, you're probably going to lose.
You're right. All right, now back to the Eagles then, Michael. You just mentioned that, and I had mentioned a few minutes ago how ESPN analytics, and it's not just ESPN, there's just a general sense to me as a longtime football watcher that people don't believe in the 9-1 Philadelphia Eagles. There's a consistent reference to, this isn't as good a team as last year's team.
Well, I mean, look,
your take on this is...
Well, they're different. Every team's different, Pat. I mean, last year they scored 204 points in the second quarter. This year they've scored 68. Right. I think the difference between this year's team and last year's team is they got in front of people very quickly, and they were able to really to control the game from start to finish. Right. And this year they haven't done that, but they've won the close games, which is important, right? Now, what I think people are saying is there's a vulnerability to that, that if they play against a team that can block them, hard to do. If they play against a team that doesn't turn it over in the red zone and doesn't drop passes, they could be vulnerable. But I think every team in the NFL is vulnerable. I don't think there's one team that's just so much better than the other. I mean, look, they could have easily lost to Washington in both games. Dallas is first and goal at the 6, 1st and 5 at the 6. They can't get it in the end zone. So, but the Eagles have made the plays that they've needed to make at the timely fashion, which is all you can do. I mean, you can't control anything other than that. I think the other thing that's clear is Jalen isn't the same runner that he was last year in terms of his explosiveness running. I think he doesn't have that same quickness or the same explosiveness. He's still a good player, but I think he looks different, which makes the team look a little different. Not bad, not in a bad way, just in a different way.
I understand. But what you said there a minute ago about how the Eagles are making those plays that are enabling them to win games, doesn't that prepare them better, Mike, come January to win those one-and-done games because they just did it throughout the regular season?
Right. One of the concerns I had last year going into the playoffs was the Eagles played a Gonzaga schedule last year, and they never really were tested. And they didn't have that resiliency that they needed to fight through a tough game. They didn't get a tough game with the Giants in the playoffs. They didn't get a tough game with San Francisco because of Purdy's injury. And then when they did get a tough game in Kansas City, they were up 10 at halftime. They lost. And not because they weren't resilient, it's just because Kansas City was more resilient. So I think this helps you, but it also makes you understand that, look, if you're Nick Serriani, we got to play a certain way to win games. Like, we just can't come out and play a different way because, the games are so tight. Look, if Mahomes rarely throws red zone interceptions, he did. Kelsey's pretty secure with the football. He fumbled. Now, Scantling does drop passes, so that goes without saying. But to me, that was the game. And the Eagles, when they had their opportunity to make a play down 17-14, they're the team that made it.
Correct. It's correct. Talking here with Mike Lombardi. Michael, you mentioned Nick Sirianni, 34-14 as a head coach. In his second year, he takes the Eagles to a Super Bowl and very nearly wins it. And yet again, Mike, I just get the sense as a longtime football watcher that he's not regarded as a I don't want to say legitimate, as a superior head coach amongst the NFL's coaching elite. Do you get that same sense? And what is it that's holding back this recognition of the job he's doing in Philadelphia?
I think what Nick's done a great job of is being really coachable. I think, and I've said this about the Eagles many times, I think they do one of the best jobs of helping the head coach. They don't just hire the head coach, they help the head coach. They give the head coach the resources he needs to become a better leader, to become a better motivator, to become a better strategist. They do a really good job organizationally. They build around the head coach. And I think as long as the head coach is willing to take that advice and coachability, I think it can go a long time. And I think he's done a really good job. I don't think his ego has gotten in the way of the game planning. I think you have to give him complete credit for that. And that doesn't make him a better coach or a worse coach. That's just but what we saw with Peterson was once Peterson kind of didn't want to be in that same program, he wanted more authority. He wanted to go, he won a Super Bowl. He didn't want to have to listen and do all those things. And he decided that was time to go. Or they decided. So for me, I think that's his strength. And I think no organization does this. They leave the coach on an island. They just say, here you are. I mean, last year, the Eagles bring in Vic Fangio to help Jonathan Gannon with the defense or help Serriani with the offense, however they did it. I mean, that's a huge plus. Get an experienced guy, a guy you can bounce ideas off, a guy you can understand. They've got a lot of things that help a coach that a lot of teams don't have.
All right. Mike Lombardi, I know you could probably vouch. There's no such thing in the front office as a trap game, right? I guess you guys you were neck deep in the next week's opponent as soon as the final gun sounded on the game that was just played. But is there such a thing as a trap game in the locker room? And are the Eagles perhaps looking at one this Sunday with San Francisco and Dallas on the horizon?
I mean, look, they got back late Tuesday morning from Kansas City. This is a short week for them. They've got to heal their wounds. It was a physical game. And they're playing a team that, they don't have a lot of familiarity with in terms of playing them. And so that makes the game challenging. How McDermott calls the game, how McDermott will play the game. This is a team that loves to play nickel defense. You try to play nickel defense against the Eagles, they're going to run you out of the game. I mean, the Eagles have not run the ball effectively in the last 2 weeks. And their offense has not been very good in terms of they've been under their norm averages. So they're going to have to play their best. And I think the team knows that, right? What makes this game so hard isn't that they're overlooking them. It's the situation they're in. Short week, new opponent. If they were playing Dallas or if they were playing a team that they knew, it would be a little better. But Buffalo's a stranger team. They're not the same Buffalo team they were 3 years ago, but Josh Allen presents a huge problem for them. They're going to have to figure out how they want to handle him, and I'm sure they prepare for it in the offseason. So I don't see it as a trap game. I see it as a situational game that's challenging.
Okay. All right. And it is. I think it is challenging, and I think they may be catching the Bills at a bad time, Mike. But the Eagles so far in this gauntlet, 3-0. They beat Miami, beat Dallas, beat Kansas City. You can't argue any of that. But I do think you're right. I think this is a challenging game for Philadelphia Sunday. Michael, I want to ask you about quarterbacks. You have seen them come and go. Six starting quarterbacks so far this year out for the season in the NFL, and numerous instances where, Mike, it's plain that the second string quarterback is simply inadequate.
Yeah.
And it's caught so many teams where there's such a drop in that quality when the starter goes out that the whole season gets skewed. My question to you as a longtime NFL exec is, how does the league not address it, but how do we increase or do something about developing better quarterbacks for the NFL?
Well, I mean, Bill Walsh said this all the time. There's very few people who can coach the quarterback and even fewer that can evaluate him. So this is really a residue of that statement. I mean, look, teams carry third quarterbacks because they're familiar with their offense. Tim Boyle threw less than 50% completions at UConn, and he's going to start a Thanksgiving game tomorrow at 12:30 against the Green Bay Packers against on Friday for the Jets. Yeah. I mean, how is that possible? Well, he's bounced around. He knows Nathaniel Hackett's system. Doesn't mean he can execute it, but he knows it. So I think a lot of it is because there's just not a lot of great coaches to develop quarterbacks. Brady talked about this the other day. Like, the coaching is really, I think there's a huge advantage in the NFL today if you have a really good coaching staff, especially one that can develop players. That's key, can develop players. I mean, I think the Eagles gained such an advantage with their offensive line coach, with their defensive line coach. I mean, they develop those linemen and they get the high premium out of them. The same thing in San Francisco. So, but not all those teams have that. The Eagles would never let that line coach out of there. They're going to keep him there forever because he's that good. And I think the same thing happens with offensive football. There's just not a lot of guys that understand how to coach the quarterback and what offense needs to be running. You can't run Jalen Hurts' offense with someone else. You got to kind of modify it. I mean, the Bengals are going to go from Joe Burrow, who did everything, to Jake Browning now, and they were 31st in rushing attempts. Now, that meant Joe Burrow was going to have to carry everything they did offensively. Do you think Jake Browning's going to have it? He needs a running game. But the Bengals are 31st in attempts. They're 30th in yards. They're 31st in yards per attempt. I mean, they have no run game because they relied on Burrow so much. They've never built a complete team to offset it. And I think that's some of the problem.
You're absolutely right. How many? And I know this is some somewhat simplistic way of looking at it, but you're right. The Bengals are a classic example of a team that has an offensive line that's used to backing up and not going forward. And I guess, Mike, you can't switch that on a dime, can you?
You're over with. Now you can't even practice, Pat. You get one pad at practice. Nobody's in pads. This is the time of the year where the physical teams, the teams that play with great pad level, the defensive lines that can come off the ball and play with physicality, they take over games now. because everybody stopped practicing. It's more walkthroughs. It's more, we got to keep everybody healthy for Sunday. When the teams that are practicing and improving now, I mean, this is the critical time. Weather's going to be a factor now, right? You're not going to be, I mean, look, that game the other night, we didn't discuss it, but the weather was effective for both quarterbacks, right? It wasn't easy to throw the ball in that game. Right. And Kansas City, surprisingly, I mean, for Andy Reid to call 30 runs is an awful lot, is a huge, huge achievement.
Right.
But they could come off the ball and they blocked.
Yeah.
Because Andy Reid's a physical coach who teaches physicality. Some of these other guys just want to draw pass plays.
Fair enough. Now, Michael, before I let you go here, and I just want to, one last thing, and just looking around the league here, and I'm only going to concentrate on two coaching hot seats because they're so odd. It's one of them is one you would never talk about, but you worked in New England. Is this it for Bill Belichick? And the other seat that I want you to comment on is in the same division. Is Sean McDermott heading out the door if Buffalo fails to make the playoffs?
Well, I mean, I think McDermott, since the 13 seconds failure in Kansas City, has been struggling to gain credibility. Leslie Frazier left. He wanted to run the defense. Now he's fired, Ken Dorsey. So, if they don't get to where they want to go, this usually happens with NFL teams where, we saw it with Jim Moore in Indianapolis. They couldn't quite break through. They hired Tony Dungy after that. I don't know what the Pagula family would do in Buffalo. As for Belichick, I mean, it's kind of it's interesting. The guy who's won six Super Bowls is on the hot seat. Meanwhile, we're not talking about Ron Rivera. We're not talking about Brendan Staley. We're not talking about, some of these other coaches that have not done a very good job. It kind of, I mean, look, let me say this. If Belichick, like we saw with Andy Reid, if the temperature in the building and it's time to go, I think they'll both make that decision like Jeffrey did, with Andy did. But much like Andy, Bill won't be unemployed very long.
No. I agree with you. I would agree with you there. And there's no reason why he should be. And I think he has a hell of a chance to catch Shula's record. All right, listen, Mike Lombardi, I want to thank you very much for taking all this time. The GM Shuffle podcast, the book, Football Done Right. Looking forward to that. That sounds like a great read. And I'm looking forward to getting a hold of that. And it was great talking with you.
Thanks,
I appreciate it, Mike. Have a good Thanksgiving. And I'd love to have you back before this season is over. All right.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate you.
All right. Mike Lombardi joining me. That was a great segment with Mike there. The guy is just a wealth of football knowledge, longtime executive in the NFL with about 6 different teams and many, many stories he could tell. I'd love to have a couple hours just to talk with guys like him about what they've seen and what goes on in those windowed offices in the National Football League. All right, when we get back, Justin Mark's going to join me. We're going to talk some betting lines and I'm going to get his opinion on how maybe that potential trap game in Philadelphia and a couple other, including a couple of Thanksgiving Day tilts. We'll get Justin's opinion on that. We got much more to do here on a Thanksgiving edition of This Week in Pro Football presented by Kennedy Ford.